Hey everyone, Fresh here. In this video, I wanted to actually talk about some tuning changes that were announced kind of late last night going into the new patch that's coming out today. And these tuning changes are pretty much focused entirely on a bunch of different tank busters in various Mythic Plus dungeons. And since this is a change targeted at Mythic Plus, and my channel focuses pretty much exclusively on Mythic Plus dungeons, I figured this would be kind of a good thing for me to talk about here. Granted, I'm not a super high-end player. My warrior's at 2,800 rating. I think my paladin's close to 2,600 rating, and I have a druid guardian spec that's about 2,400 rating. So I've done a lot of different 10 keys on 3 different tank specs now at this point. Haven't done them on every single tank, so I'm not quite as well versed in other tanks as other creators and things like that, but I feel like I can speak at least from like kind of a casual mid-core player perspective on where tanks are at and how they feel to play in dungeons. And talk about kind of these changes and whether these are a good fix for kind of how tanks are feeling to play in dungeons and why there's such a kind of drought of tanks just showing up in pugs. And I think the reason for that is twofold. One, I think, is kind of an overlaying problem with the War Within expansion itself, with the changes they made to tanks before the expansion launched. And two is I think there's actually kind of an underlying issue that's been present at this point for a pretty long time in World of Warcraft that I think gets addressed occasionally, but I don't think it gets talked about enough. So first, let's just talk about the kind of problems that tanks are having in the current expansion and in the current season. And kind of use these changes as a lens to look at those. So if you notice when you were looking at the changes to basically the nerfs to different, enemies throughout these dungeons, they're mostly just magic tank busters, right? So like this Orator Crixvix, this is the first boss in City of Threads. Subjugate is kind of the tank buster attack that they do. This Twilight Flame Render, Shadow Flame Slash, this is like also a tank buster. Same with the Molten Giant Lava Fist. Missive Turn of Scythe, the Mistveil Guardians, they get, a slight reduction to their damage buff, so it makes their anima slashes not do quite as much damage, but I still don't think this is sufficient enough if you're worried about the anima slash attack. The Cursed Slash damage, this is like the curse buff that you get from these Curse Blades in Siege of Borealis that usually I don't worry about because I play with a Shaman healer, so they're pretty good about making sure that curse doesn't stay on me for very long. And then the Voidbound Despoiler Shadowclaw cast time, as well as the cooldown increasing. These are basically just a bunch of various kind of magic-based tank busters that they're nerfing pretty significantly. I think in an aim to try and help with the tank situation that's been going on in this expansion. But realistically, yes, these are good changes, I think. Like Lava Fist in particular, when I'm not playing a warrior, this ability sucks. It hits really, really, really hard. And if I don't have a defensive up for it, you feel like you will absolutely just like get one shot by it. So yes, this is a nice little change for sure, especially the cooldown increasing. So that way, you don't go into attacking a Molten Giant and feel like, oh crap, I don't have a defensive cooldown up. I'm going to die if I get hit by a Lava Fist if you're not playing a warrior. The funny thing is a lot of these things are warrior doesn't even care about because you can spell reflect these. Shadow Flame Slash, you spell reflect. Lava Fist, you can spell reflect and spell block. Mistveil Guardians, Anima Slash, you can spell reflect. Voidbound Despoiler, Shadowclaw, you can spell reflect, and in fact the cooldown increasing I think actually is kind of an indirect buff to spell reflect because now you can spell reflect literally every single Shadowclaw unless you double pull, but if you're pulling one at a time you can spell reflect every single one. But basically, yes, these are good nerfs. They will help a little bit. But the fundamental underlying problem with tanks isn't magic tank busters. It's the fact that you just are getting absolutely just clobbered. You're getting crushed by like any sort of attacks against you. White auto hits basically are doing a ton of damage to tanks if you're not a warrior. Even Paladin, who feels a lot tankier after the 11.05 changes, there are times when I will mess up and hold off on pressing a defensive when I should have pressed a defensive and literally just die because of that. basically holding a defensive for like 2 to 3 seconds, essentially bricks the key. And that's not fun gameplay, right? Like, that's not fun or enjoyable gameplay. And it's not like the times I was dying, these were even like big pulls. These were like 5 mobs or things like that. Is that on me to play better? Absolutely. I take it as an opportunity to try to learn and try to improve and figure out where I went wrong. But also, like, for newer players or players that maybe aren't experienced with the spec, maybe they're trying out a new spec because they want a change of pace. I've done that in previous expansions where I'm like, hey, you know what? I am not really feeling this tank that I usually play, this class, so I want to try a different class out for this expansion or for this tier or expansion or whatever it is. And I've done that in the past. And there's a learning curve when you're playing a tank. And the fact that you can just literally just fall over from like white hits, I think can be really frustrating for new players. So I really think the tank nerfs they did before the expansion were, I think, just a really bad design decision. Their kind of philosophy that they talked about in that post when they talked about nerfing tanks was they're like, we want a more symbiotic relationship between tanks and healers because we want healers to feel like they have to heal the tanks, basically, right? Which is kind of like an old, I think, MMO philosophy when it comes to class design. It definitely feels like very much like a classic WoW kind of mentality when it comes to designing tanks and healers, right? Because in classic WoW, you're pretty much entirely self-reliant on the healers, and in fact, all the healers do in most scenarios, most PvE encounters, is they just heal the tank, right? And that's just not current World of Warcraft. The way encounters, dungeons, and raids are designed, that's not how current World of Warcraft works, right? Healers can't just sit there and just like throw 2.5 second, cast time heals into the tanks. They really have to be doing a lot of other things, right? There's a lot of like movement that's involved in a lot of these encounters. There's a lot of like damage that's going out to the party. There's like things that need to be dispelled. There's just a ton of things going on with modern WoW design, which isn't a bad thing. I think it's fun and engaging content, but I think there's this disconnect between how how the designers and the developers see the relationship between tanks and healers. And the problem is that the kind of attacks that like monsters do now on tanks are so strong that healers don't have time to react and heal a tank that's getting, dying in like 2 globals, basically, right? I distinctly remember I was doing a Grimbatol 10 on my druid, and I was going into one of those packs after the bombing run. And I think there was only like 3 or 4 mobs in the pack. And I literally, before I was even in melee range, I hit Bark Skin, which is a 40% damage reduction cooldown. I go into the pack, and immediately, within like a global, I'm at 40% health. I'm like, what? This isn't fun, right? Like, I pressed a powerful defensive cooldown, and here I am, all of a sudden, worried about dying versus just like auto attacks against a pack with like 4 or 5 mobs in it. It's not fun design. They really just need to revert the tank changes. I don't know why they did that. They did this in Dragonflight. At the beginning of Dragonflight, they nerfed tank survivability, and then they end up reverting it and rebuffing tank survivability like later on in the expansion. It's not classic, guys. We are in modern World of Warcraft. You need to design around your modern encounters and your modern design. You can't try and force like an old philosophy with these new encounters and designs. The TLDR of this is, are these nerfs good? Yes, these things probably hit too hard. They probably do way too much damage to non-warrior tanks. But ultimately what they really need to do is they need to just take a good hard look at how tanks are surviving overall when it comes to not just magic effects, but also, auto attacks and things like that. And they need to, they basically just need to revert the changes they made at the beginning of the expansion. I don't know if they're going to do that. It feels like they are trying not to. It feels like they're trying to do other things, but whatever it is, they either need to do that, or I think the world, may just be living with like paladins and warriors for a very long time. With all that said, that's kind of the overlying issue I think that's going on with tanks in Mythic Plus. But I do think there is an underlying issue that has been present for a pretty long time, probably honestly since the beginning of Mythic Plus back in Legion, and it probably even goes further back than that. And ultimately, I think this is the how the community treats other players, particularly in pug environments. In the last probably, I would say, year or two, I feel like I've really softened up a lot when it comes to playing with other players in my group that I don't know. In fact, if you ever watch my streams at all, you may notice that sometimes when we're looking to fill a fifth for our Mythic Plus group, a lot of times I'll actually try to invite players that I notice are maybe like one key off from getting like Keystone Hero, for example. I'm doing a 10 for the week. I've got a Mist of Turn of Scythe that I'm just wanting to do just to fill my vault, and I throw the queue up, or I throw the key up in the queue, and I notice, oh hey, there's this player, they're 2480, they only have a +9 Mist done, and they've signed up. Let's invite them and let's get them their +10 Mist done, so that way they can get Keystone Hero. I think there's a really kind of negative just perception when it comes to pug players and basically pug groups, right, and how they interact. I can talk about kind of my experience outside of World of Warcraft, specifically when I went and played Final Fantasy for a while, Final Fantasy 14. I was like, hey, I want to try out a new MMO. I've heard a lot of great things about Final Fantasy 14. I think this was actually before the big kind of exodus in Shadowlands when a lot of WoW players were playing Final Fantasy. I think I picked it up like a year or two before that. And the thing that really struck me was people were like nice in dungeons. It felt weird, right? I was like, oh my gosh, people are like actually nice. And I can attest to, as a tank, whenever I've tried, pugging, being in pug groups in Mythic Plus dungeons, I've been flamed in the past. Like, absolutely, people just ripping into me because of mistakes I make, or I'm not familiar with the dungeon, because I'm coming back, or I'm new, or whatever it is, or if it's the beginning of the season and I'm trying to learn the dungeon, right? And really the best way to learn is by doing. And I've been absolutely positively just like the most toxic things said to me because I'm tanking. And generally as a DPS, you're not going to experience that, right? Like, you can just get in the key, you can just follow the tank around, you can just press your DPS abilities, and if you don't say anything, as long as you aren't like doing anything super crazy, like, if you die like 10 times, you might get flamed or whatever, but even then, for the most part, people will ignore you. But if you mess up as a tank, the community will absolutely, you can get completely flamed, and that contributes a lot to tank anxiety. So I think there's kind of an underlying community problem when it comes to pugs and groups with Mythic Plus, and really I don't know what the developers can do to fix that. I think they need to figure out some way to start curating kind of the social experience in WoW a little bit more, and I feel like they're scared to do that. And I think that really, like, there needs to be something done, some sort of system put in place, whether that's something where, like, you give like thumbs up to someone at the end of a key for saying, hey, this person like did a really good job, or whatever it is that they have to do. I think they need to start taking some sort of proactive steps towards it, because I think really that is the underlying issue with why there is a tank and healer shortage. There will probably always be a tank and healer shortage. Those are roles that just have more responsibility than the other roles, even when tanks and healers are in a good spot and are fun to play. Ultimately, I think that because of the responsibility and because of the kind of anxiety that comes with playing those roles, fundamentally there will always be less of those roles than DPS roles. But the community toxicity is definitely not helping with that, in that area, right? So I really think that something needs to be done by the developers, by, basically by the designers, to figure out what can we do to help try to like kind of mitigate some of the toxicity in this community, and try to start promoting a more positive, kind of environment for Mythic Plus. And I don't know what that is, but whatever it is, I do think they need to be more proactive about it. So anyways, those are my thoughts kind of on the changes that happened, with the patch and everything, and just my general thoughts on tanks, both in this season and just kind of overall, like kind of the experience of being in a pug environment. But anyways, thank you everyone for listening. If you do want to see kind of more content like this, again, I focus pretty much on Mythic Plus tanking. I've got a lot of videos up, some guides and things like that. So, go ahead and subscribe and click the like button. And I do stream over at Twitch, so twitch.tv/freshtanking. You can go over there. I do stream generally my Mythic Plus runs pretty regularly, so you can check it out there. Anyways, thanks again everyone for watching, and have a good one.